And welcome back to the second day of this Shamatha retreat. So I'd like to start this morning by doing a little bit of a review of some of the things we've covered yesterday before we move on to the topics for today. So Shamatha, of course, is a Sanskrit word which we can divide into two parts. The first part, shama, means non-discursive or calm. And ta means to remain or abide. So often the word shamatha is translated into English as calm abiding, meaning a mind that is very calm and focused and is abiding on a single object. So what we're talking about here, of course, is the concentration practice, developing our attention skills, the practice of developing a calm, clear and focused mind. And this shamatha practice is one of the core practices within all the Buddhist traditions. Because this is really the basis of all the other practices. Because with the other practices such as vipassana and loving kindness and compassion and so forth, those practices are for the purpose of transforming our mind. And if our mind is always agitated, distracted and dull, then we won't really be able to do this transformation very well. So therefore, if we can put effort into this shamatha practice and really develop a very calm, clear and focused mind, then that serves as a good basis for us to do our other practices of vipassana, loving kindness, compassion, and they will be much more effective. We'll be able to really transform our mind very effectively then. But of course also shamatha practice has immediate benefits for us in our daily life as well. Because if we put effort into this practice and develop a very calm, clear and focused mind, then of course we're going to be much more effective in everything we do in our life. Much more calm, much less stress, much less agitation and mental disturbance. Often that translates also into better physical health, and also we can then enjoy simple pleasures in life much more than we do now. So there are a lot of immediate benefits as well. Now in this practice, yesterday we saw that there are two core qualities that we're trying to cultivate in this practice. They are stability and clarity. So stability, of course, means a stable mind, being able to focus on an object without becoming distracted. But not only do we want to be able to focus without distraction, we want to be able to focus in a very clear way. So this is clarity, overcoming dullness. But yesterday we added a third quality to the list that I think is very important for us to keep in mind in this practice, and that is the quality of relaxation. This wasn't really mentioned so much in the old meditation texts, and I think the main reason was centuries ago people tended to be very relaxed in general, so it didn't need to be emphasized. But I think unfortunately in our modern society that's often not the case. We don't tend to be very relaxed. We tend to be very highly strung, a lot of agitation, a lot of stress, go, 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 fast-paced lives bombarded by stimulus, a lot of tension in our lives. Our minds tend to be very chaotic. So we have a lot of tension, a lot of distraction, which means, of course, in our daily life, when we want to focus on anything, we tend to apply more tension because our minds are so chaotic. And of course, if you only have to focus on something for a very short time, that could sort of work. But we know from our own experience, if we focus with a lot of tension for a longer period of time, we become completely exhausted and often become very agitated. So this is not the approach we want to follow here in shamatha practice. So the very first quality we need to cultivate in this practice is relaxation. We need to learn how to relax, and unfortunately in our modern society, many of us have forgotten how to do that. So we need to relax the body, relax the mind. And to really emphasize, and as a beginner, one of the most common difficulties we experience in meditation is simply because we're too tight, we're too tense, we're trying too hard. So a lot of problems come from that. So if we can really learn to relax, we can already eliminate a lot of problems in meditation. And that relaxed state is an effective basis for then developing stability and clarity. And to really highlight the importance of relaxing, then I'd like to talk about that based on from a book from Alan Wallace called Attention Revolution. Attention Revolution here is a very good book about this shamatha practice, and I'm following it actually quite closely over these 2 days. Alan Wallace is from California. He's been following Tibetan Buddhism for about 40 years. He was one of the very first monks in Dharamsala in the 70s. He was a translator for Dalai Lama. For 20 years he was following what's called the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, and for the last 20 years he's more moving into the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. And one of his main focuses these days is the shamatha practice, because although shamatha practice is one of the core practices in all Buddhist traditions, when you look at all the various Buddhist traditions and see what people are actually practicing, this shamatha practice seems to get left out. You know, in a lot of the Theravada traditions, we talk about, you know, vipassana, vipassana, vipassana. And in the Tibetan tradition, often it's, you know, deity yoga, bodhicitta, emptiness, you know, all of these practices. Great. But without some sort of stable, clear mind, none of these practices are going to be very effective or work very well. So unfortunately, this shamatha, even though it is an integral part, seems to get left out a lot. And so then people put a lot of effort into these other practices and don't make much progress, and then wonder what's wrong. And one of the main reasons is no stable, clear mind. So these practices don't really work very well. So he puts a lot of emphasis on the shamatha practice. So I'd like to read a little bit from his book here, because he talks about this idea or this importance of relaxation. And he's talking here in the context of the practice we did yesterday of focusing on the breath. He says the following. This is on page 14 of his book. Thus, our practice of mindfulness of breathing consists of prolonging our awareness of our breath. While this requires an alert mind, such concentration should not be tense, but rather balanced. When we discover that we have become distracted from the meditation object, it may feel natural to clamp down more forcefully, tightly concentrating the mind. You can see this in the facial expressions of people who try to concentrate in this way. Their lips become pursed, their eyebrows draw together, and their foreheads become furled with wrinkles. They're becoming concentrated, but like orange juice, most of the fluidity is being drained from their minds. If you want to concentrate for a short time and don't mind the side effects of tension and fatigue, you can follow the above strategy. But if you want to follow the path of shamatha, you'll need an alternative. I had to discover this fact through experience. During my first extended shamatha retreat, I was filled with enthusiasm. I wanted to take full advantage of the rare opportunity that was before me, for I was meditating in India under the guidance of the Dalai Lama. I had no financial worries, and my material needs were easily met. All I had to do was to put the instructions into practice. I threw myself into this training with all my might. Each morning I would rise at 3:30. Except once, I slept in until 3:45 and got upset with myself for slacking off. Enthusiastic I was, but so uptight. The Tibetan manuals on shamatha meditation that I had studied over the years stated that the type of attention needed when one began such practice was, quote, highly focused. So I tried as hard as I could to keep my mind from wandering. Within a matter of a few weeks, devoting many hours each day to meditation, I could sustain my attention on my chosen object for up to half an hour. I was elated by making such fast progress. As the weeks went by, however, I found myself becoming more and more fatigued. I was draining myself both physically and mentally. My joy in the practice was diminishing accordingly, and I felt my attention was not developing any further. What was wrong? I was trying too hard. The cultivation of shamatha involves balancing the mind, and that includes balancing the effort exerted in the practice with relaxation. I think this points to a cultural difference between traditional Tibetans living in the highlands of Tibet and modern people leading fast-paced lives, their senses constantly bombarded by telephones, email, the media, and noise. Years of such existence conditioned the nervous system and mind in ways that might have been considered torture in rural Tibet. One traditional Tibetan doctor whom I know once commented on people living in the West. So now he's quoting the Tibetan doctor who says the following: "From the perspective of Tibetan medicine, you are all suffering from nervous disorders. But given how ill you are coping remarkably well." Whether we dwell in Boston, Buenos Aires, Berlin, or Beijing, our minds are conditioned to be more high-strung and engaged in compulsive thinking than the minds of Tibetan nomads and farmers living a century ago. So when Tibetan meditation manuals advise beginners to focus their attention firmly, the instructions are aimed at a very different reader than the average city dweller in the 21st century. Before we can develop attentional stability, we first need to learn to relax. So that's something I know from personal experience. So really, in this practice, the first thing we really need to do is to learn how to relax. Relax, 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 relax. It's only on the basis of a relaxed body and a relaxed mind that we have an effective basis for developing stability and clarity. And the same goes for all other meditative practices. Relaxation is the basis. So we really need to emphasize that. And unfortunately, many of us have forgotten how to relax. We're always go, 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 tension, tension, tension. So we really need to let go of that. And of course, then that will translate into a much more relaxed attitude in our daily life as well. Then we also looked yesterday at the objects of shamatha practice. What object should we focus on? Again, the general recommendation is to use the object that works best for you. In these 2 days, we are focusing on 3 objects that I think can be helpful or beneficial, particularly for us in our modern society. So yesterday, of course, we worked with the breath. 3 variations of that practice. First, the full body, noticing sensations anywhere in the body associated with the breathing. This is very good for relaxation. Then we worked with the abdomen for a while. This is very good for stability. And then we moved to the nostrils in the afternoon. Because smaller object, this can be very good for improving clarity of attention. Today, we're going to now move on to 2 other objects. The first is observing the mind. And that has a lot of benefits, and I'll explain shortly what those are. And then following that, we're going to look at the practice, which sometimes is called shamatha with no object. Sometimes called awareness of awareness practice. This is simply resting in awareness. And again, a lot of benefits with this practice, and I'll explain that later this morning. And so to talk a little bit about the objects of shamatha practice, so again I'd like to read a little bit from Alan Wallace, because he also comments on this as well. So this is on page 6 of his book, and he says the following: to guide meditators along these 10 stages, so when he says 10 stages, he's talking about these 9 stages plus the result, shamatha, those 10 stages. To guide meditators along these 10 stages, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I have found effective for people living in the modern world. These three techniques are the basis for the three divisions of this book. For the first four stages, the first four here, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continually returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. Beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. So that's what he calls this practice of observing the mind. In this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences, all the events, that is, thoughts, mental images and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen or Great Perfection lineage, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. The technique is called Shamatha without an object. Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity, as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. The training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the very beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. You may use any one of these 3 methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So again, the general recommendation is in this practice, use the object that works best for you. And in general, it's recommended to stay with that object. Don't keep changing the object, because then we're not really going to progress very far. Having said that, you can also do a little bit what Alan Wallace said, is that perhaps you want to focus on the mind, and we're going to be doing that today, and many of you may find that very difficult, but you'd like to do it, but you find it very difficult. Then you can do a little bit what he suggested, is you can, for the first few stages, use the breath. So you can work with the breath, maybe for some weeks, months, or longer. And then when you reach a certain level of stability and clarity, a more stable mind, then you can switch to focusing on the mind and continue. But to keep changing every week what you focus on is a little bit counterproductive. So that's a little bit about object, which we covered yesterday. And then, of course, the 2 main tools in this practice that we saw in this diagram was the rope of mindfulness and the hook of introspection. So the main tool is mindfulness, and here in Buddhism, mindfulness is defined as basically remembering the object. It's our ability to hold the object without forgetting it, without becoming distracted. But then we need a second tool, introspection, which is like quality control, that has to monitor that mindfulness. Are we still holding the object, or are we starting to get dull or distracted? To notice that. And of course, if we notice that we become dull or distracted, then to reapply the mindfulness. So these are the 2 main tools we use in this practice. And then we looked at the various faults that can arise in this practice. And the first fault we saw there yesterday was laziness. So typically, when we find ourselves being lazy with respect to this practice or other practices, it's mainly because, like everything in our life, we don't really appreciate the benefits of it. So, like everything in our life, if we don't really see any benefit in a certain activity, we're not going to want to do it. We're going to be very lazy when it comes to doing it. But if we can really appreciate the benefits of anything, we're going to put a lot of effort into it. Similarly here, the antidote to laziness in practice here is to really reflect on the benefits of this shamatha practice, to see how much this practice will really benefit us. Then we're going to be enthusiastic, we're going to put effort into the practice, we're not going to be lazy. So that's a little bit of a review of a few of the things we covered yesterday. So what I'd like to do now is move into the second object of focus, and that is the mind. And in Alan Wallace's book, he calls this practice settling the mind in its natural state. So in this practice, the object of the practice is the mind and whatever mental events are arising in the mind. Thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. What is not part of the object is the sense objects. So sensations in the body, sounds, visual objects. These are not part of the object, so then we're not focusing on that. So in this practice, we're not doing what sometimes is called open awareness. Open awareness is just being attentive to whatever arises, anything. This is not that practice. This practice is only focusing on mental events, thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. Which means if a sound arises or a sensation in the body arises, we are not to attend to that. It's a distraction. Let it go and come back. Let it go, come back. So we're only observing the mental events, the mind and any mental events that arise. So this is the object. Now, like all the shamatha practices, we are observing the object directly with what's called bare attention. Similarly with the breath practice, we are observing the tactile sensations of the breath. We're not visualizing the breath. We're not imagining the breath. Similarly here, we are observing the mental events directly with bare attention, meaning we're not thinking about the mental events. We're not commenting on the mental events or trying to understand the mental events. We are simply observing them directly as they arise and pass. So what are the benefits of this practice? Now, many of you are probably going to find this a little bit more challenging than observing the breath. Breath a little bit easier because the object is physical, whereas the mind is not physical, it's mental. And also, we don't tend to have the habit of observing mental events. Generally, what we do is when some mental event arises in our mind, we do one of two things instantly. The most common thing we do, of course, is we identify with it and we follow it. And then we get caught up in our mental events and stories. And often they overwhelm us. And the other thing we instinctively do is if a mental event arises, thought, emotion, memory, and it's sort of unpleasant, and we don't know how to deal with it, the other thing we instinctively do is we try and suppress it, try and push it back down. And of course, doing that doesn't deal with it. All that happens is it sort of builds up a bit of a pressure cooker, and often that negative mental event then manifests as physical illness. I think a lot of physical illness in the modern society is purely through suppressed mental events. And then also what we do is, through suppressing it, we can still feel that it's there. But because we suppress it and we're trying to deny it, what we do is we project it. For example, if we have some anger issues and we don't know how to deal with it and we're suppressing the anger, then often we sort of, we can feel that in the body. But because we're suppressing it, we've sort of disowned it. But because we can feel it, there's anger. Yes, there's anger, but it's not me. Them, they're the angry ones. So then we project it onto the people around us. So this is a sure sign that we're doing this, is that if you see someone who's exhibiting a certain behaviour that really irritates you, but it doesn't seem to irritate anyone else, that's often a sure sign that they're reflecting something in you that you don't want to acknowledge. So next time you get irritated by someone's behaviour, check. I mean, of course, if everyone's irritated, it may be the behaviour is quite irritating. But if you're the only one that seems to be irritated by it, often it's a sure sign that something in their behaviour is reflecting to you something in you that you don't want to acknowledge. That's why you're irritated. So check that. So basically now we tend to be the slaves of our mind. We are tormented by our mind because mental events come up, we follow them, we get caught up in them. If they're unpleasant, we try and suppress them. We are really the slaves of our mind. With this practice of observing the mind, where not only, of course, is it a shamatha practice of developing a calm, clear, focused mind, but another huge benefit of this practice is that we will become the masters of our mind. Because every time we can observe a mental event arise and pass, without following it, without suppressing it, we're not feeding it. Which means the habit of that mental event coming up will get weaker and weaker and weaker. Our mind will naturally become more quiet and still. You know from your own experience now, you can't make the mind still. You try and make the mind still, it just gets more agitated. So we don't need to fight with our mind to have a still mind. All we need to do is not feed it. If you don't feed it, it will become quiet naturally. That's all we do. Step back, don't feed it, and then it will, over time, become more quiet. Also, of course, every time we do this, not only does the habit of these mental events coming up get weaker and weaker, but because now we're developing the ability to observe a mental event arise and pass, then in future, if some strong mental event were to arise, we could simply be present with it without it overwhelming us. Because actually, if you look at what a thought emotional memory is, it's virtually nothing. It has no power in itself, none whatsoever. It's not like someone with a big stick breaking our skull. These mental events have no power in themselves. They only have power if we give them power. And we give them power by identifying with them or trying to suppress them. If we just step back and observe, they have no power to harm us. They're virtually nothing. So by doing this practice, we will really become the masters of our mind. So therefore, I think for many of us, this brings enormous benefit in our life. Also, by simply observing our mind and these mental events, we also start to appreciate a little bit the nature of our mind, because we're observing it directly. And so this can lead us into realizing the nature of our mind, which of course is a Vipassana practice. So this is also a very good bridge into the Vipassana practice. So these are some of the enormous benefits of this practice. To talk about the practice, again, I'd just like to read from Alan Wallace because he talks about this practice, of course, in his book. So let's have a look what he says about this practice and then make a few more comments and then we'll enter into the practice. He says the following: the object of mindfulness in the practice of settling the mind in its natural state is no longer the subtle sensations of the breath, but the space of the mind and whatever events arise within that space. The object of introspection, as in the earlier practice of mindfulness of breathing, is the quality of the attention with which you are observing the mind. Now he's quoting a text which gives a very brief summary of the instructions, and the text says, "At the beginning, have many daily sessions, each of them of brief duration, and focus well in each one." So this is something I'm going to talk about this afternoon, is that in general, but in particular here in Shamatha practice, the key is quality over quantity. It's much better to practice shamatha for 20 minutes in a focused way than sit there for an hour just getting caught up in dullness and distraction. Because if you do that, you're just increasing the faults, the very faults that you're trying to overcome. So always emphasize quality over quantity. So very much emphasized in shamatha practice as a beginner,